Hello, welcome back to Talent Thrives Here, our podcast where we talk to people managing people. Our special guest today is Mr. Joseph Bell. Joseph has a long career in the visual effects industry, helping grow small studios into medium and large size studios. And he's been an executive working at many companies and different businesses where he looks at the operations from an executive lens as well as the lens of data analytics. He likes to drill into the numbers and get away from some of the blustery marketing stuff in our world. Joseph recently put out a very interesting study about the visual effects world titled The VFX Atlas. It's available at vfxatlas.com. I highly recommend you download the ebook at that site. It is chock full of information he and a small team put together. It's actually overflowing with information about the multi-billion-dollar VFX industry. Joseph, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lance. It's great to be on with you.
Great. I'd like to start I think you and I, because of our history in the business, could probably talk about a number of things, but I want to talk about scaling a business. And some of those things are, industry specific to VFX, but also a lot of companies as they grow, if they've landed a large project, then they need to add 50, 60, 100 people. What are some of the things that you would sort of see are your fundamental, I must build this first, if we're building the pipeline of growth and how we're going to build a rapidly expanding organization? As an executive looking at that, what would be some of your first sort of, your top 3 or 4 things you want to dig into?
The first thing I look for is what's going to break when we're bigger. It's typical for small companies that are growing to put tools in organically as needed. A particular project needed something and we still have it. So you tend to have sort of legacy solutions and workflows that will give out, next year when we add another 50 people. So it's always a good idea to be out in front of that. When you are so busy and growing that breaks, you will be too busy to fix it. So if you can see it, if you can see it coming, that's a good one. So whenever I look at technology, whenever I look at how teams are being managed, I always say, if I were to double the amount of information you're dealing with or the amount of projects, will it still work?
Yeah. Yeah. I was at a place many years ago where we were historically sort of a 200 person organization, and we flexed 225 or 180, that kind of, it was always around 200. And I distinctly remember a management team coming in and say, like, we want to really double the size of the place at some point in time. And I remember one of the things saying to the CFO at the time, I said, the back end of this business, the things that take us 4 weeks to do now will take progressively longer, or there'll be a fire burning we can't even see because we're so busy growing. Yeah. So, part of that was looking at the infrastructure, because I said to them, every time we've got near about 300 people historically, you can feel the creaks in the building. Like wherever we've got a weakness, it's now magnified,
It's funny how that manifests itself. I mean, I'm thinking back to one of the larger projects I worked on, which involved hundreds of visual effects artists working on a single project, hundreds of deliverables. And the systems that were in place to track the status of all of that stuff sort of became overwhelmed by the volume of data. The database was a little clunky. It took too long to return a search query with all of the information in there, so people stopped using it. And it sort of felt like surfing on this giant wave of data. You were okay if you stayed on your surfboard, but if you fell off your surfboard and had to find something that, wasn't top of the list, it just became an unmanageable task. So it's a really, it reminds me of that book, The Mythical Man Month. Not sure if you've seen that one, where it's about developing operating systems in the early days, and Microsoft Windows, I believe, was developed originally by a very small team, and they got it done. A competitor went in with a very large team, and contrary to sort of popular belief, they couldn't get it done, even with more people, because the complexity of managing a bigger team sort of outpaced them in terms of moving forward with the product. So the solution often isn't adding more people. It's to say, how can I get data in front of a reasonably sized team and sort of empower them and make it quicker for them?
Right. Yeah, it reminds me too of years ago, I recruited in advertising and marketing a lot. And there was one of the presidents of a very sort of hip, very hot shop agency. He had a quote from the U.S. military, and he said, when a unit gets above 100 people, the effectiveness starts to drop. Yeah. So every time his agency got around 100 people, he'd splinter off and build a small sort of skunk
Yeah.
works or some other team that had a different focus so that
Hmm.
it didn't impact the whole place, and I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting. His number was 100. And I often find as
There's
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's some anthropological theory that humans are adapt. I don't know if this is true, by the way. This
Mm,
is just, that humans are adapted to be in tribes of up to 120 people. So again,
yeah,
without going into the science of that and whether it's accurate, the
yeah,
theory is that it's natural. You can know 120 names. You can kind of get a sense of the dynamics, and then once you go beyond that, you're in a different type of organization.
yeah, yeah. Fair enough. And something you and I have both seen for many years now is this sort of move offshore. There's a
Yeah.
and I'm curious if you were building a business. Let's say it was 25 or 30 people, and you're going to add 50, 60. You're going to break that 100 mark. At
Hmm.
what point, or do you do it right at the beginning? Is there some component you would take offshore early, or wait
Hmm.
till later? And I guess there are a number of factors around that. But from your experience, what would that look like? Because as you and I have seen so many digital
Hmm.
production companies got an arm somewhere in Asia
Hmm.
to do a portion of business.
Yeah,
Are there any
exactly
sort of
right.
levels where a tipping point, let's say, where that might start to become more feasible or
I
reasonable?
think that's one of the areas where I want to set it up from the get-go. I mean, the reality of the visual effects business and many businesses is that there are components of it that have to be offshored in order to be able to price competitively. It's just the way it is.
Yeah,
And that will be a feature whether you're a 10-person company or a 1,000 or 10,000 person company. So the sooner that we build that into our process, the better. I mean, the other
yeah,
thing about it is that it's, I think, easier culturally if you just take that approach from day one. I think, the places I've seen it really be a problem is, places where they've been working internally without outsourcing or offshoring anything.
right,
And it's not necessarily that the people there enjoy every aspect of the work or,
yeah,
can't see it being done by someone else. They're just used to, they're in a routine. And so to take a team like that and say, good news, guys. We're gonna, take this thing you
yeah,
don't much like doing and send it away.
right.
That still is a cultural shock.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's it too. That the shift from we've been doing it this way for 5 or 10 years in this group,
Yeah.
it's new. Whereas to
Mhm.
to your point, if it started right out of the get go, then that probably isn't new and it isn't a shift. And yeah,
Mhm.
and I've
I mean, the,
seen
the other
many.
thing you see is, Lance, is that, depending on who's driving that change from on high, I think you can do it in a sort of sensible, pragmatic way, or you can do it in a sort of, well, we have a number to hit, guys, so just do
Yeah,
it kind of way.
right,
And, obviously, ideally, you have a bit more insight than that when you implement these things. So
right,
I think it is easier if, what you're proposing to send out makes sense to the people you're asking to send it out,
right.
and is not just a sort of mandate.
Yeah, and to your point too, I think how it's introduced, the bedside manner, the communication
Oh, yeah.
strategy behind that is really
Yeah.
critical. And I think it threads into a lot of other conversations too. But I'm curious about lessons learned from your side when you're growing some of these corporations, or even if you get into them at mid growth and you're starting to look at a strategy plan for either business development or marketing. Um,
Mhm.
Again, if you're analyzing a business, what are some of your key components as to I've really got to drill into this first, as an
Mhm.
example?
Well, I've worked a lot in creative industries, and so I'm I'd say a very sort of people centric leader or manager. So that obviously that takes a lot of my focus when I first come into a new company, and I'm sizing up where the strengths are and where we need to sort of bolster the capability. I think people ask, what's the number? When is a company big enough for X?
Right,
And I think over time I've realized that it depends on what the company is doing. I'm sorry to give a vague answer, but there's no one number that is
right,
where every company needs to hire their first HR person.
right,
I was with a startup in Los Angeles at one point that ultimately grew to be at 180 people, and we brought in a full-time HR person let's say around 60 people.
Mhm.
And that was the nick of time, I would say. Not
Right.
because anything's going wrong there. We just had, health plans to administer and things like
Yep.
this. And, it was, beyond the founders who had other things to do. So that was the right moment to bring in an HR person. Conversely, I worked with a company recently that had they were doing a very diverse set of work types with a very small team. And the way they produced world-class work in this wide range of types was that they would bring in experts from the outside very regularly to tackle these different types of projects. So they had a relatively small core team, and they're bringing in the experts project by project. So even at a dozen people, it was going to be a full-time job for someone to come in and manage the HR and recruiting aspect of that. So here's a company that needed HR at 12 people and one that needed HR at 60. And I think those were the right moments for those two different companies.
Yeah, yeah, no, I take your point. I mean, I've seen it many times myself where there's an office manager, and that
Hmm.
person's kind of like the catch-all for all sorts of
Oh
things.
yeah.
And then, as to your point, at a certain point, they're like, "Yeah, we actually need an HR person because there's compliance or
Hmm.
there's other things contractually that we need to start
Yeah.
entering into this environment."
Hmm.
And then, the other thing I look at sometimes is when do they add a recruiter? Because
Yeah.
sometimes HR, the person you have, isn't really a recruiter, but they
Right.
get thrown into that. Well, it's all HR. Let them do recruiting. And you're like, no, it's kind of a different role. And
Hmm.
I went to HR school a million years ago. And we always said there's 9 kind of facets of HR, from
Hmm.
benefits administration and payroll and all the
Right.
other plugs of it.
Yep.
And recruiting often was talent acquisition is often its own thing.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
as a company grows, you want to have a specialist probably at some point that
Yeah.
understands the marketplace and the people in it and the disciplines. And
Hmm.
I find that it has to have a focus, and that's where sometimes they've called us like, hey, we don't have that
Hmm.
focus yet, or we don't have that person,
Yeah.
or 3 years ago when things were so busy in this industry, they'd say,
Hmm.
we've got 8 recruiters but we really need 10, can you guys come in?
Yeah.
Because there's a
Absolutely
shortage
right.
of talent around the globe at
Hmm.
one point. It was wild. But
Yeah.
anyways, other
I did
Joe.
a
Yeah, go
project.
ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. No, go over to
I
you.
was going to say I did a project last year for an investment group that was looking at buying a visual effects studio.
Yeah,
And in terms of doing their commercial due diligence for them, there are all kinds of questions like, do the finances look good? And, do they produce good product? And this particular investment group was thinking of having this company be the first of several acquisitions. So they were thinking of
right.
doing a roll up where they'd buy, that first company, and then they'd add additional units around it. And, so with that in mind, I look at the org chart and this is a company with, a couple of hundred people. And they have, I want to say, a 12 or 15 person HR and recruiting team.
Mhm.
And that's what I like to see in this situation because I
Yeah,
look at it and I go, I can see these people have somebody, they're recruiting a lot of talent internationally.
yeah,
They need specialists, and on
yeah,
their staff, they have someone who's sorting that out, who's getting people
right.
onboarded, who's getting them settled. So if you say to me, should we, acquire this company as the basis for growing scaling a much larger
Yeah,
group? Yes. Yeah, they're very
yeah,
well equipped.
yeah. No, that's a very, very good point. And as you know, as it grows bigger, the migration team internally of moving project to project, artists
Yeah.
and engineers, and that
Hmm.
becomes a huge project management
Yeah.
task as well. And
Yeah.
I've seen many companies where, again, at a tipping point, at a certain number,
Hmm.
it's being handled by producers and APMs and everyone else. And then at
Yeah.
some point, it's like, you know what? Someone has to own this part.
Yeah.
We need to
There's
hire
there's
one
a
or two or
point at
three
which running
people.
lean it
Yeah,
becomes counterproductive.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
sometimes it's hard to put a cost on these things, but you can do it. I mean,
yeah.
if you gather your producers around and you say, okay, guys, how much of your day do you spend doing X?
Right.
And then does that add up to a salary or or sending it out to someone?
Yeah,
And it's often quite amazing. It's the same problem with technology, actually. It's always making judgments about the roadmap of developing a pipeline. When do we invest X hundred hours of engineering time in
yeah,
improving that part of the pipeline? And so you sit down and you do the math and you say, well, if writing that tool is going to save every artist in this facility 10 minutes a day,
Right.
and we have several hundred artists times 10 times,
Yeah.
5 times, how many, 50 weeks. Wow. And then their average cost of that is that.
Right.
And oh, we're going to save so much money if we just hire a programmer to save everyone those, and they're going to be happier.
Right.
So, when you go to the CFO and you're like, we need 2 more, that's the way to do it.
Yep. Yep. Excellent. Fair enough. Joseph, I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to wrap.
Yeah.
And I think we will probably connect on some other topics. So I really
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you being on the show today. Thank you so much. If there's any salient points you want to drop before I cut our time, I really appreciate you being here. And
Mm-hmm.
I truly think we could talk for hours, but I'm not sure who would stay with us.
Well, this was fun, Lance. Thanks. I enjoyed it a lot.
All right. Cheers. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon.
Take care.